Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an interview with a guest or multiple guests, or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In today's episode, I'm unpacking a paper titled Defining and Designing Computer Science Education in a K-12 Public School District. This paper is written by Chris Proctor, Maxwell Bigman, and Paulo Blikstein. Apologies if I mispronounced any names. Here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, computer science is poised to become a core discipline in K-12 education. However, there are unresolved tensions between the definitions and purposes of computer science and public education. This study's goal is to explore how logistical and conceptual challenges emerge while designing a comprehensive K-12 computer science program in a public school district. While the policy infrastructure for K-12 computer science education is rapidly developing, few districts have yet implemented computer science as a core discipline in their K-12 programs, and very little research has explored the challenges involved in putting ideas into practice. This study reports on a committee designing a comprehensive K-12 computer science education program at a small public school district in California. Through a grounded theory, qualitative interpretation of committee member interviews, and board meeting transcripts, we surfaced three themes, which were the primary points of tension: how computer science education is defined, how it ought to be taught, and what process ought to be used to answer these questions. Grounding these tensions in the academic discourse of K-12 computer science education, this study offers recommendations to other districts designing comprehensive computer science education and suggests future directions of computer science education research that will be most useful to stakeholders of these processes. End quote. If I were to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I'd say that this study serves as a case study of a district's processes and tensions developing a plan for implementing computer science across K-12. So if you are brand new to computer science education, or your district is brand new, and you really want to expand across the entire district, this case study might serve as kind of a tale with some things to consider before going into it, as there are some interesting lessons that can be drawn from this, and considerations that can be made if you are going to work with the district on developing implementation across K-12. But note that this is just one example, and there are many ways of doing this. And I say that as somebody who works for a nonprofit that has worked with many districts across the nation. Everybody does it in a different way. But it's important to hear other perspectives and go, oh, that's an interesting idea. I want to do it that way. Or, oh, I really don't want to do it that way, etc. Now, in the introduction of this paper, the authors mentioned that there is a thriving economy around edtech and out-of-school learning opportunities that are relevant to computer science education. And the reason for this is because of the social value placed on understanding computing, whether it be as specific as coding or as broad as computational thinking or computer science as a domain. Many companies are saying they want more people with background in computer science, whatever that may mean or look like. And many states or districts are adopting computer science education standards that are then being required of teachers in school districts. However, at the moment, not every district and every student is receiving computer science education instruction. And by the way, code.org actually released a State of CS report recently. I'll include a link to that in the show notes. So if you want to see how is your state doing, check it out. Really simple, easy to understand. And it's got some interesting data, and you can be like, oh, well, how does my state compare to the state next door or the state I previously taught in? Now, in the introduction, the authors also know that there's not enough discussion on how other people end up doing implementation in K-12 districts. Probably the most frequently discussed approach for this that I've seen is using SCRIPT, which is an acronym for a program developed by CS for All to help districts come up with their own implementation plan that is unique to their interests and needs, etc. I'll include some links to some podcasts of some people who actually worked on scripts or worked at CS for All in various capacities. So if you want to learn more about that, make sure you check out those podcasts in the show notes, which you can find at jaredoleary.com. or by simply clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on. And while you're there, you'll notice that this podcast is powered by Boot Up Professional Development, which is the nonprofit that I work for. What's interesting about this case study is this district ended up spending 3 years designing their K-12 CS program. And this particular study, this paper, discusses the questions, quote, what is the district's vision for computer science? 2, how should the district's K-12 CS program be implemented and taught? 3, what process should be used to answer these questions, and who should participate? End quote. It's from pages 314 and 315. All right, so the next section of the paper is a background section. I'm going to skip over that and just jump right into the methods. Here's a quote from page 315 that kind of describes the district. Quote, this study was conducted at a small, wealthy suburban school district in California in which a committee composed of students, parents, teachers, and school leaders has spent the last 3 years designing a K-12 CS program, end quote. Now, the high schools already have multiple computer science courses, likely because this is a very affluent district with high social capital. And the authors note that many of the committee members actually engaged in various leadership capacities in K-12 CS education. But again, it's interesting to note that it's parents, teachers, students, leaders, etc., who are all kind of collaborating, or sometimes not collaborating, arguing with each other about how to implement across K-12. And for this study, they looked at interviews and transcripts from various presentations and public discussions, like at the school board of education meetings. All right, so the next section gets at the results. So the first subsection is titled, What is Computer Science? Now, the authors note that the committee unanimously agreed that computer science is important, but they all had different rationales for why they felt it was important. So some would say equity is important, or interests, or economic opportunities, or believing CS is an important literacy or skill that relates to everyday life and digital citizenship, etc. Now, I've done multiple episodes that actually talk about the visions framework from CS for All, which is related to the script workshops that I previously mentioned. So make sure you check out the show notes at jaredoleary.com for those podcast episodes, which basically talks about how the vision framework helps people figure out their vision for CS. What are their rationales, their drive for why they think it's important or it should be implemented? And that can help people to engage in conversation to go, oh, I think computer science should be this, but you think it should be this other thing. That is interesting. Let's talk about these similarities and differences in our values around the rationales for CS education. One of the really interesting findings on this particular paper is that the committee had fundamental disagreements on, well, what exactly is computer science? And because of this disagreement on just like a single definition of it, it really impacted the effectiveness of their conversations. And then there's also fundamental disagreement on what the focus should be of the conversations. So some wanted to focus on inclusion efforts, so getting more students to participate, while others wanted to focus on diving deeper into rigor. So here's an interesting quote from a teacher, and this is on page 316 to 317. Quote, a teacher taking this perspective argued that de-emphasizing programming, for example, through unplugged activities, is a disservice to students. Quote, if you're teaching origami in computer science class and some guy out in a wealthy city is teaching kids how to actually write programs, I've got very little doubt which kid is likely to be in better shape coming out of those two classes in terms of being able to function well at the next level. I think it's creating a chasm between the haves and the have-nots, end quote. And I know that right there is going to be some fighting words for some people. Some people might say, well, unplugged are really great ways to lower the barrier of entry, get people interested in both taking a CS class and even teaching a CS class. And then other people look at it and go, okay, but that's not actually programming. You're just kind of skimming on the surface of understanding without actually applying it with increasing complexity over an extended period of time. Now, it's not to say that if you do unplugged, you can't do programming. You can certainly do both. But it's interesting reading these arguments because I've been hearing these arguments for years now. Some people want to talk about inclusion. Other people want to talk about rigor. So it's really interesting the way the authors frame this. It's kind of like two poles on a continuum where people kind of gravitating around in their conversations on implementation. And here's an interesting quote from page 317. Quote, this epistemological tension is paralleled in the academic debate over computational thinking, even though the term was used only 12 times in our corpus. Over the last decade, proponents of computational thinking have argued for a practice-focused vision of computer science, often including collaboration, creativity, and the construction of identities and communities where computational practices can emerge. Computational thinking has been useful to those arguing for teaching computer science at the elementary level, for interdisciplinary computer science, and as a lens on inclusion and equity. Others, likely in agreement with the teacher quoted in the previous paragraph, feel that computer science and a useful definition of computational thinking ought to be more narrowly defined, focusing on the application of core computational ideas through programming. Too heavy reliance on computer science practices risk obscuring the powerful ideas that make the field transformative, empowering, and worth teaching, end quote. And if you're interested in some more nuanced discussion on the tensions around computational thinking and what one of the authors actually proposes with CAFI as computational literacies, I highly recommend checking out the podcast that I did almost a year ago now, actually, titled A Revaluation of Computational Thinking in K-12 Education, Moving Toward Computational Literacies. Really interesting paper that I unpack in that particular episode by Kafai and Proctor. Now, another interesting thing that the authors note in this particular study is that on this committee, there were a lot of tensions around people who had identities as computer scientists and those who did not, and how those various levels of expertise kind of butted heads at times. But speaking of some tensions, the next subsection is around the question, how should computer science be taught? So at the elementary and middle school level, they agreed that computational thinking should be interwoven throughout the classes in an interdisciplinary way. And 69% of the committee agreed that computer science should be a graduation requirement, with only 15% who were against it. And the other remaining percent of people tried to find another way or just abstained from voting on that one, which is why that does not add up to 100%. However, interestingly, even though there is support for the graduation requirement, quote, there is substantial disagreement about what sort of course should be required. Mirroring the two different understandings of computer science, there was a group emphasizing rigor and another group focusing on exposure. The former group was interested in the AP Computer Science Principles course, citing the number of people who have worked hard on that, including people from the university level, while the latter group was interested in emphasizing the broad applications of computer science in an inclusive manner. The committee ultimately did not reach an agreement on the nature of the required course, as they focused their efforts on first securing the graduation requirement, end quote, from page 317. That's really interesting. A while back, I did a little mini-series on integration, and one of the key things that I was talking about throughout those episodes was it was important to really sit down and talk about, well, what do you mean by integration? Same thing here with the overall definition of computer science. Well, what do you mean by what it's going to look like? So while the majority of people agreed, yeah, it should be a graduation requirement, once you actually dive into it, goes, well, what does that look like? Is it going to be a single course? Could it be multiple courses offered, like one focusing on rigor or another focusing on exposure, etc.? These are all really important things to consider when it comes to what does this actually look like. So for example, when the authors mentioned that they were engaging in an interdisciplinary way of engaging in computational thinking, well, what does interdisciplinary mean to you? Does it mean I use the term decomposition in my class, therefore we have now done computational thinking, check, I'm marked that off my list for the month, and we can move on? Or does it mean engaging in scratch projects to demonstrate understanding? Those are two very different approaches for engaging in computational thinking in an interdisciplinary way in an elementary class. So it's nice that the authors talked about these tension points rather than just the agreement. Far too often, there's this tendency to paint things as rosy and like, yeah, everything was great when it came to this study, you should fund me some more. This is not saying the authors did that, not at all. In fact, they did the opposite. They said, here are some things that people agreed upon. Here are some things that they did not agree upon. And I really value that. They share those aspects of these conversations because it's important to realize this is going to be a difficult and apparently long and drawn out process since it took 3 years for some districts. Now, jumping back into the findings again, rather than just my commentary, one of the other interesting conversations that they had to have was, okay, well, are we going to replace a graduation requirement? Or are we going to add on a new graduation requirement, which would then take away an elective from students? And oh boy, I would love to have been sitting in the audience at that conversation with a bucket full of popcorn. We would have listened to that. That is a really good question to consider. That could have profound impact on students. Like for people like myself who were in ensembles like band, that made it so I might have 0 or maybe 1 or maybe 2 electives by senior year that I could take. Oddly enough, I actually just recently talked to my wife about this, and she said that she only had 1 other elective that she could select from in high school, but she was also in band. So if we take that away, does that mean students who are committed to something that they've potentially been doing since, like, I don't know, 4th grade, let's say, they want to continue it all the way through high school, but then they don't have electives to choose from because they have so many graduation requirements? What about what happens 5 years from now when we have another new graduation requirement for another really interesting and super important domain? So the students who were a part of this, who, quote, spoke against the requirement, cited the overwhelming demands of the existing requirements and the limited choice in their schedules. One student summed up a survey of his peers. Quote, they're less against the idea of teaching computer science than they are with the idea of more requirements, instead suggesting that the district might loosen up curriculum and rethink the idea of what students must know, because right now we're all working under a system that's collapsing under its own weight, end quote, from page 317. So then the question became, quote, Should students be able to choose their courses, or should districts determine what courses students need to take? On the one hand, one board member argued for a requirement from an equity perspective. Quote, if we believe that computer science is a critical skill for being a citizen in the modern world, then we really can't accept a situation in which our female students and the underrepresented minority students are not participating in that at the same levels as other students. That really should be unacceptable to us. And I think a graduation requirement is a way of addressing that, end quote, from page 317. But then on the other hand, try to go with some of the arguments I've made in other podcast episodes, is that a form of epistemological colonization, or ontological colonization, or axiological colonization? So epistemological, like ways of learning or knowing, ontological, ways of being, and axiological, like ways of valuing. If we add on more requirements and say students have to do this thing because I value this thing and think it's important for them, is that then colonizing their ways of knowing, their ways of being, and things that they value? I can see both sides of an answer to that, yes or no, but I definitely lean more towards yes. So for example, in high school, I had an academic counselor who was really set on me getting into Harvard. Because of how I placed on some test scores, I was placed into a group of students who this special academic counselor really wanted us to all get into some Ivy League school. And whenever I'd go meet with him, he'd be like, oh, well, you should drop band, or better yet, leave this school entirely and go to this other program that was for students who tested high on these honors tests. And you'd get a laptop, you'd get all sorts of like one-on-one attention and get to take more rigorous courses, and this would look great to get into Harvard. And my response was every time was, I'm not interested in going to Harvard and I want to be in band. This academic guidance counselor, although well-intentioned, did not care what my interests were and just wanted to serve his own needs and what he thought was best for me. Turns out I've done just fine. Even though all my degrees are in music education, I pursued my passions, and that led me to computer science education. And it has allowed me to bring to this field a perspective and set of experiences that are unique for many CS educators. So I'm able to look at things in a different way. Had I followed the academic guidance counselor's advice, I wouldn't have those perspectives. And quite frankly, I probably wouldn't be as happy because I ended up exploring my own paths, my own interests in life, and how I could help other people. So that long-winded tangent to say, the more courses we add, the less likely students are going to be able to pursue their own interests, and the more it's going to come across as colonizing students' ways of knowing, being, and what they value, in my opinion. And if you disagree, that's okay. Happy to chat with you on the podcast. Contact me button on my website. Okay, so that was a discussion on subsection 2 in the results and some of my own thoughts embedded throughout that. But now let's look at subsection 3 of the results. This question focused on what processes should be used to answer these questions. So the authors kind of hint at like a Bourdieusian power perspective and talking about social cultural capital in terms of sometimes the experts who had background in computer science education weren't actually viewed as experts in a domain. So for example, when it comes to pedagogy and teaching, the teachers would have more social capital or more cultural capital in that particular question or context. And if you want to hear a paper that actually talked about Bourdieu in relation to computer science education, I'll include a link to that in the show notes, as well as the discussion with Kimberly Scott. We kind of talk about the different forms of capital that influence us. We also talk about that in some other interviews, like with an interview with Joyce McCall, which used the Shire as a metaphor for systemic racism. Highly recommend listening to that episode. Here's an interesting quote from page 318. Quote, in some cases, the construction of expertise was explicitly about power and whose voice counts. One male teacher explicitly excluded the expertise of the women quoted in the previous paragraphs. Quote, it's tough because, I felt like other male teacher and I were the two subject matter experts in the room other than a couple of parents who were in the business. And I think both other male teacher and I, at different times during the past couple of years, have, threw our arms up, end quote. This teacher has strong views on what constitutes computer science and on how it should be taught, and frequently saw himself in the minority on the committee. These interactions portray computer science knowledge as situated in particular identities, contexts of use, and power relationships. This is not a dominant perspective in computer science, end quote. Honestly, you could probably write an entire paper just on that little embedded quote within there from that teacher. I read this quote to share that whenever engaging in conversations around education, everything is gray, not black and white. It's gray. There are many perspectives to consider. And sometimes when a group leans in one direction, those who disagree with that will feel left out. Or if the group has a leader who ultimately listens to everybody's perspectives and has to make some kind of a decision with input, whatever decision they make, somebody, most likely, is going to disagree with that. and that's to be expected. So it's important to consider these different relationships and contexts and power dynamics at play and how things are perceived. Because even if we make statements like, I think students should be able to choose what they want to learn, while I strongly agree with that, I can also see situations where I think it's important for subject matter experts to determine what students should learn in X, Y, or Z. Most of the time, I disagree with that second statement and instead prefer the first one, letting students choose. But sometimes I agree with the other perspective. It depends on context. Now, because of that, one of the findings from this that they talk about on page 318 is that it is important to consider the size of the committee when engaging in these conversations, because it can have a profound impact on the efficiency of that conversation. Having been in many professional conversations before, it's sometimes easier to work in smaller groups rather than to have everybody work on something all together. So for example, I helped Wyoming develop their computer science standards. There was like 50 of us or so who all met long before COVID and chatted about the different standards. We started in a group of 50, but then broke down into much smaller groups where we could get into the details around specific standards in different grade bands. So I worked in the 3-5 grade band. Then we come back together as a full group and discuss things, and then break it down into a smaller group again. And so it kind of alternated between those. That was an effective way to have everybody to listen to and understand perspectives while also being able to kind of work through things in smaller groups. If we had stayed in a group of 50 the entire time, the standards would still not be written today. But because of the approach that was used, we were able to get things done. So if you are going to work on some kind of a committee that determines how you implement in the classroom, maybe consider a smaller group or kind of alternating between large group feedback, small group goes and works on something, brings it back to the large group to get some more feedback and continue that cycle. Now, the authors in the discussion ask some really important questions that I highly recommend taking a look at. But here's a little paragraph that I'm going to read from page 319 that kind of summarizes things. Quote, "For stakeholders of schools designing comprehensive computer science programs, this study offers several lessons. It is important to realize that there are substantial, unresolved disagreements about what constitutes computer science, and that any implementation will need to take a stance on what matters most. People's understandings of computer science will be situated in their own experience, and the process of developing a broadly shared operative definition of computer science should include time to discuss these different backgrounds. In order to include participants without existing computer science experience, it may be necessary to invest in community education efforts. Despite these efforts, some people will be skeptical that computer science ought to be a priority. If they are not also included in the process, they may solidify into an oppositional faction. The question of whether to require a separate computer science course may be a crux point, essential for equitable participation, but also in competition with other priorities for the limited number of courses that can be required. The same factors which have historically excluded students from participating in computer science are likely to affect potential participants in the process of designing a computer science program." End quote. So I highly recommend reading this paper. It is a single case study of a single district, but it is something that I highly recommend taking a look at because there's some interesting findings. At the end of these episodes, I'd like to share some lingering thoughts and questions. I kind of embedded a lot of those throughout this particular episode, but I guess a question that I might have for you, and hopefully you can engage in this conversation with other colleagues in the field, is what implementation approaches have worked for you or other districts that you're aware of? And how might we share those successful approaches with other districts who have not yet started implementing CS? I hope you enjoyed this episode. Really interesting findings and discussions in this particular paper. If you also felt it was interesting, please consider sharing with somebody else or leaving a review on a podcast app that you're listening to this on. And again, check out, there's a bunch of podcast episodes that I referenced in this one. They're all included in the show notes. There's over 150 some odd episodes currently released. So many more interesting papers that were unpacked in really awesome interviews with some pretty cool people. And when I say awesome interviews, I mean they were awesome, not like giving myself a compliment or anything, because that's, yeah, not something I do. But anyways, check out the show notes at jaredoleary.com. There's also hundreds, if not thousands, of free computer science education resources, including a link to bootuppd.org, which is where I create free coding curriculum, work on research, do some other cool projects and service efforts. Well, anyways, stay tuned next week for another episode. Till then, hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.